Hello and welcome back to my 10 favorite people. Hope you're doing well. I'm incredibly excited for today's video because we're going to talk about exactly what I believe is most likely to happen for Bitcoin in 2025 and why. And it's so nice of Bitcoin to do nothing but chop sideways in our trading range during the 2 weeks that I was away. Now, I love these Bitcoin trading ranges because we don't need to have a crystal ball. We don't need to jump to any conclusions. As long as Bitcoin is within the trading range, the base case should be more chop. But then once we see a close above the range high or below the range low, then the probabilities of Bitcoin's next move goes up significantly in either direction. And although I wasn't really paying attention to YouTube and Twitter much, I'm sure everybody was fearful because of some bearish narrative when Bitcoin was trading around 91,000. And I'm seeing a lot of excitement and sentiment once again now that Bitcoin is revisiting the resistance at our range high. And this is why I titled my last free weekly report before I traveled Signs of Weakness, because for those of you that have been following the channel for a while, I'm sure you'll remember my conviction that this was a reaccumulation phase for Bitcoin before it broke higher, and it wasn't a cycle top or a major top like what we saw in November 2021 and in April of 2021. And that's because we had a very slow and systematic downtrend that looked like one major bull flag, and Bitcoin likes to put in its major tops with a deviation above the range high where everybody gets excited and euphoric and piles into long leverage positions. And then once it breaks back into that range, that's your major warning sign that Bitcoin has put in a major top. We saw something very similar in April of 2021. We did not see that in March 2024, which is why I had so much conviction that the cycle wasn't over. But we did see that recently above 100K when we established our range, broke above it. Everybody got excited as we traded above 100,000, and then we saw an aggressive sell-off back into the range. Now, this doesn't mean that we just had our cycle top and it's time to panic and run for the hills, but it does mean that 2025 is likely going to be a lot more difficult to navigate and a lot more volatile than 2023 and 2024 were, especially now that Bitcoin is at much higher prices. And now that Bitcoin has put in this bearish engulfing candle above our range high with a deviation, my base case for Bitcoin has to be a decent sized pullback as the most likely scenario to at least the mid 80Ks, maybe the high 70Ks as a worst case scenario as of right now, but that looks a lot more likely than Bitcoin just teleporting higher from here, in my opinion. Now, this pullback is quite healthy. For weeks, we said that Bitcoin couldn't spend too long in the extreme greed region and that this time wasn't different. And recently, we've seen a very nice reset into the neutral zone on the coin market cap fear and greed index. And we're also seeing this very clearly in the price targets that I'm seeing all over the news articles, all over YouTube, all over Twitter. A couple of weeks ago, everybody was arguing on whether the top would be 300K or 500K, but now we're seeing much more calm price targets like 130K per Bitcoin, and I'm seeing this all over social media and YouTube right now. A lot of that bullish euphoria is cooling off, and I expect that trend to continue before Bitcoin puts in its next major rally. And that brings us to what I believe is most likely for Bitcoin in 2025 and why. And I know having different outcomes and probabilities frustrates a lot of newer investors. I know it would have frustrated me when I first joined this market, and I was more drawn to people who had all-in conviction on Bitcoin crashing and going down, or Bitcoin skyrocketing and going into a super cycle. But I have found that it is much easier to manage emotions and be prepared for surprises if you're actually watching out for multiple outcomes and not just the one you're hoping for or the one your favorite influencer is convinced has to happen. And this is because a lot of our major narratives haven't really fully played out in my opinion, and I haven't seen the type of euphoria we saw in November of 2021 or April of 2021. Especially in altcoins, we still have this strong Bitcoin treasury narrative. We have some countries around the world talking about Bitcoin reserves. And even if those treasuries don't end up happening, the conversation itself is quite bullish. And we're seeing something similar with corporations running the same Bitcoin treasury playbook. We also still have our Bitcoin spot ETF narrative in full swing. 2024 was a record-breaking year for Bitcoin spot ETFs, and I'm sure the large asset managers like BlackRock and Fidelity will only take this asset class more seriously after how beneficial it was for them in 2024. And I still think this narrative and this trend has a lot more runway to go before we see our cycle top. And yes, after major inflows into the spot ETFs, we do see some outflows, and that's just normal for these type of products. I know a lot of people say these are long-term holders that are never going to sell or take profits, and they're going to buy these ETFs and dollar cost average into them and hold them forever. I don't think that's the case. I think they will take profits, and if we do see weakness in macro and for the S&P 500, I do expect outflows from these ETFs to increase, but in the longer term, I think having these ETFs is only going to help with Bitcoin's supply dynamics, and I think it should be good for price in the short to medium term, and especially in 2025. And speaking of good for Bitcoin in the short to medium term, MicroStrategy is still announcing fundraising to buy more Bitcoin, which means that I do believe that Bitcoin's price could still go higher. Now we are seeing the size of these buys and the conversations that MicroStrategy is having beginning to decrease, and we also see that reflected in MicroStrategy's stock price. For a couple of weeks, I've been talking about how this looks like a major blow-off top, and I would be very surprised if MicroStrategy traded above $500 this cycle. This looks very similar to what we saw in 2021. Huge blow-off top in MicroStrategy as everybody piles in, and then Saylor uses that premium and uses that volatility in the stock to raise money to buy Bitcoin, but that results in a top for MicroStrategy. Could something different happen? Maybe, but as of right now, this strong of a move and this much FOMO and the amount of media attention MicroStrategy received during that time period, I would be very surprised if this wasn't the top for MicroStrategy. Yes, it can still put in a lower high in the mid 400s or high 300s, but we'll continue to monitor this as we go forward. And if we were to see a repeat of 2021, we would expect Bitcoin to top a couple of months after MicroStrategy did, and that aligns with our Q1 2025 top thesis. Now, if the strategic reserve, spot ETF, and corporate treasury narratives play out in the short term but underdeliver, I think that results in the Q1 2025 top. If somehow they end up being a lot better than expectations, and maybe we see strategic reserves all over the world, the ETFs have another record-breaking year in 2025, and we see a bunch of large corporations following the MicroStrategy playbook, then maybe we could have this Q4 2025 top scenario where Bitcoin surprises all of us and goes a lot higher than many people anticipate. It's not my base case, but it's a possibility that I'm open to. So I'm always going to make sure to leave some positions running even after Q1 of 2025 to make sure that I can take advantage of that scenario, even if I don't think it's the most likely. But we'll get more clarity on the likelihood of this scenario depending on what we see in Q1 of this year for Bitcoin. If we see a prolonged cool off and deeper correction, maybe we can talk about that scenario. But if we see a very steep correction and then an immediate recovery, the likelihood of an earlier top goes up significantly, in my opinion. Now, as for the cycle top already being in, I think this is a very unlikely scenario, and even mentioning it as a possible outcome frustrates a ton of market participants. But we can't ignore some of the major warning signs we're seeing for certain leading indicators for Bitcoin, like global liquidity. It tends to lead Bitcoin with a 2 to 3 month lag, and it has been going down quite aggressively over the past few months. And for the first time in this macro bull market, it's threatening putting in a lower low compared to the low in global liquidity that we set in June of 2024. We really want to see this reverse sometime soon. It's been going down aggressively because of the strength we've seen in the US dollar index, which is now deep into our risk-off region. So it's no surprise that Bitcoin has been chopping around and struggling ever since the dollar index broke into this region recently. And that's been driven by the fact that the market is pricing in less and less rate cuts for this year. Right now, we only have one rate cut priced in for 2025. Now, I expect this to change because I don't think the market and the economy can handle just one 25 basis point rate cut this year. I think we're going to have to see a lot more, and I think the Fed will do a lot more as soon as something breaks. But as of right now, their hands are tied because although we've seen the unemployment rate slowly going up, we haven't seen it spike up quite yet to force the Fed's hand. And although we've seen inflation come down quite a bit over the past year or so, we haven't seen it reach their target to give them the excuse to start cutting rates more immediately. So as of right now, they're stuck talking hawkish, and that's putting upward pressure on the dollar index, which is putting downward pressure on global liquidity. But as soon as something breaks, I think the Fed will step in quite aggressively, quite immediately. We just haven't seen an event occur yet to give the Fed that excuse and to get the market to start aggressively pricing in more rate cuts. As for my portfolio, I haven't made any changes since I've been away, mostly because I haven't been following the market too much, but I'm still quite thankful for this cash position and the fact that I took some profits while Bitcoin was in that very expensive region. I haven't made an updated 2025 version of this chart quite yet because I wanted to get this video out as soon as possible, but I hope to have one set up by my next video, and I'll definitely talk about it in Monday's free weekly report, where I'm going to talk about what I'm going to be doing with my portfolio going forward and whether or not I'll be taking more profits or doing any buying in the short term based on Bitcoin's current structure. Now, we do have to remember that we're coming off of an incredible year for Bitcoin, Solana, Ethereum, and other risk assets, so we could see a little bit more volatility this year. But if we do end up having another good year for Bitcoin, I would expect Solana and Ethereum to outperform, especially Ethereum because of how much it's lagged up to this point. Its price structure looks quite good, and although we had a rejection at 4,000 once again, I think we're putting in some type of meme head and shoulders pattern here before Ethereum eventually breaks higher. And I think a lot of that is going to be driven by ETF inflows. We saw $2.6 billion in December, which is not that impressive when you compare it to what Bitcoin has been seeing, but it is still nice to see regardless. And if we do get those Ethereum staking ETFs this year, that could really help Ethereum's inflows because ETF buyers, as of right now, are giving up those staking rewards and not getting that yield that investors love so much. So I'm watching Ethereum staking ETFs quite closely this year because I do think we will see them in 2025. As for Solana, I did not like the fact that we closed below our range high of 200. It's nice to see that we got that bounce off the 20-week moving average and it was reclaimed quite quickly. As of right now, Solana is just going to follow whatever Bitcoin does. I really want to see us hold above 200. Otherwise, things could get quite concerning quite fast. And the main narrative that I'm watching for Solana this year is a US Solana ETF. I think a lot of the smaller issuers are going to be filing for them regardless. Seeing BlackRock or Fidelity file for one would be a huge deal, but I don't know if we see that in 2025. If we do, it likely ends up being very bullish for Solana, especially if those end up being staking ETFs. But as of right now, the poly market odds are about 80%, and I think that's in line with what the market currently believes. So people aren't convinced we're going to see those ETFs, but they think there's a high likelihood, and I'll be watching this narrative very closely for Solana in 2025, as well as the regulatory clarity narrative. Now that we're having an administration that's a little more crypto friendly, that should be really good for adoption. And I would not be surprised if a lot of asset managers like Morgan Stanley start adding more crypto products because they don't have to worry about lawsuits and being taken to court because they listed certain ETFs or certain products that the SEC and the previous administration were against. As for traditional markets, obviously this is going to have a huge impact on Bitcoin, so it's nice to see the S&P 500 holding its 20-week moving average, which it has done going all the way back to November of 2023. aside from a very brief drop in August of 2024 when we had the madness surrounding the Japanese yen carry trade. And I'd like to see the S&P 500 maintain that uptrend because we know that Bitcoin has a very close correlation with the S&P 500. Bitcoin just tends to move more aggressively in both directions, and you've seen that very clearly over the past 2 weeks. So if the S&P 500 can maintain its uptrend, I would expect Bitcoin to do well also. And a lot of that is going to have to rely on the federal government spending. Now we're going to see a lot of narratives surrounding this with the new administration and what ends up happening with Doge and whether they're actually able to reduce government spending. I don't think they'll be able to reduce much as of right now, but we'll continue to monitor that as it develops in 2025 because over the past few years, we've only seen that deficit continue to increase, and I'm not convinced that trend is going to change quite yet. And as long as we see that debt continue to increase, we know that it has to get monetized eventually, which should put upward pressure on the money supply. And if the money supply is going up, that's good for our risk assets like the S&P 500 and good for our fixed supply risk assets like Bitcoin. But anyways, let me know what you expect for 2025. What's the most likely scenario? Will we have a standard 4-year cycle where Bitcoin tops in Q4 and everybody gets to hold hands and sell the top together? Or will we have something slightly different, and will investors front run each other by taking profits and selling early? Or do you think it's all over and the top is already behind us and everybody is about to get blindsided by a terrible 2025? You guys know what I believe to be the most likely scenario, but I'm happy to change my mind if the data changes. But as of right now, I still think that the early 2025 top is by far the most likely. But as always, thank you so much for the support on the recent videos. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll talk to you soon.